April 1865, Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. The Confederacy is finished. 4 years of war, more than 600,000 dead, and it all comes down to a quiet farmhouse where Robert E. Lee has just surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia. The fighting is over. The South has lost. And in the middle of that wreckage, Ulysses S. Grant, the man who broke the Confederacy, walks across the grounds toward a defeated Confederate general. He doesn't gloat. He doesn't lecture. He walks up to James Longstreet, one of the most important commanders in Lee's army, and says a single word. Pete, a nickname, an old one from another life entirely, from before the war, before Gettysburg, before any of the blood. And in that one word is the whole tragedy of what just happened, because James Longstreet had understood something about Ulysses Grant that Robert E. Lee refused to accept until it had already cost him everything. To understand why that one word mattered, you have to go back decades before the Civil War to a time when these men weren't enemies, they were friends. James Longstreet and Ulysses Grant met at West Point in the early 1840s. They served together. They fought in the Mexican-American War together in the late 1840s, in the same campaigns, under the same fire. Longstreet watched Grant up close during those years, and he saw something that most people missed when they looked at the quiet, unremarkable man from Ohio. Grant didn't look like much. He wasn't tall or commanding. He didn't give grand speeches. Earlier in his life, he'd failed at nearly everything he tried outside the Army. Business ventures that collapsed, money that ran out. A man who at one point was selling firewood on a St. Louis street corner to feed his family. But Longstreet had seen him in war. And in war, Grant was something entirely different from what he appeared to be in peace. There's one more connection that bound these two men together, and it's almost unbelievable given what came later. When Ulysses Grant married Julia Dent, James Longstreet was there. Some accounts place him at the wedding as a groomsman. Julia Dent was Longstreet's cousin. These weren't distant acquaintances who happened to wear different uniforms. They were family, joined by blood and by years. And then the country split in half, and they ended up on opposite sides of the deadliest war in American history. Here's what Longstreet understood, the thing that became the center of everything. Every Union general before Grant had fought Lee the same way. They would advance. Lee would outmaneuver them or bloody them in a single major battle, and they would retreat to lick their wounds and reorganize. McClellan did it. Burnside did it. Hooker did it. The pattern repeated so many times that Lee built his entire strategy around it. Win one sharp, painful battle, and the Union Army would pull back. Time would reset. The South would survive to fight another season. Lee assumed Grant would be the same. Another Northern general who would crack under the pressure of heavy losses and withdrawal. Longstreet knew better. He'd warned the Confederate leadership when Grant came east in 1864 to take command of all Union armies. Longstreet reportedly told them plainly, "This man is different." He said that Grant would not stop, that he would keep coming, no matter how badly you hurt him, no matter how many men he lost, that he would fight and keep pressing until the Confederacy simply ran out of soldiers and time and room to maneuver. He told them, in essence, that the old way of beating Union generals would not work this time, because Grant didn't measure a battle by whether he won it. He measured the war by whether the enemy could still fight when it was over. Lee didn't fully believe him. What happened next proved Longstreet right in the most brutal way imaginable. The Overland Campaign of 1864 was unlike anything the war had seen. Grant threw his army at Lee in a continuous series of battles: the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, and at several points he took catastrophic casualties. At Cold Harbor, thousands of Union soldiers fell in under an hour. By the older logic of the war, this was the moment a Union general retreated. This was Fredericksburg. This was the cue to pull back and regroup. Grant didn't pull back. After the Wilderness, where his army was mauled in tangled forest that negated every advantage of numbers, Grant's soldiers reached a crossroads. One way led back north, toward safety, toward the retreat they'd all made before, under every previous commander. The other led south, deeper into Confederate territory, toward more fighting. Grant turned south, and the story goes that his soldiers, when they realized what was happening, when they understood that this general was not going to retreat, actually began to cheer. They'd finally found a commander who would not quit. Lee now faced exactly what Longstreet had warned about: an opponent who would absorb any blow and keep advancing, who treated his own staggering losses as simply the price of grinding the Confederacy into dust. The math was merciless. The South could not replace its dead. The North could. Every soldier lost on both sides brought the Confederacy closer to the end. And Grant understood that arithmetic better than anyone, and he was willing to pay it. By June 1864, the war had reached Petersburg, and the killing settled into something slow and suffocating. Trenches, siege lines, 10 months of men dying in the mud while Grant's grip tightened around Lee's army and the city of Richmond behind it. This was the war Longstreet had predicted, a war not of brilliant single victories, but of relentless, unromantic pressure that the South had no answer for. Longstreet himself nearly didn't see the end. In May 1864, at the Wilderness, he was shot by his own men in a confused volley, struck in the throat and shoulder, gravely wounded, just yards from where Stonewall Jackson had been shot by his own men a year earlier in almost the same circumstances. Longstreet survived. He returned to the army months later with his arm partly paralyzed and rejoined Lee for the final act. When Petersburg finally broke in the spring of 1865, the end came fast. Richmond fell. Lee's army, starving and shrinking, ran west in a desperate attempt to escape, and Grant chased them down with exactly the relentlessness Longstreet had promised. There was no escape. There was no clever maneuver left. At Appomattox, surrounded and out of options, Lee surrendered. Everything Longstreet had tried to tell them had come true, line by line, exactly as he'd said it would. And here's the part that should make you stop and think. After the war, James Longstreet did something almost no former Confederate general dared to do. He stayed friends with Grant. He supported Grant's presidency. He joined the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, the party of the men he'd spent 4 years trying to kill because he believed the South needed to accept that it had lost and move forward. The South never forgave him for it. The men who built the myth of the lost cause, the romantic legend that the Confederacy was noble and Lee was flawless, and the war was about everything except what it was actually about, needed someone to blame. Lee had become a saint in that mythology, untouchable. So they turned on Longstreet. They rewrote the history of Gettysburg to make him the villain who lost the battle, and through it, the war. They buried his reputation so thoroughly that for over a century, the general who understood Grant better than anyone was remembered mainly as a scapegoat. The man who was right was punished for being right, and the man whose refusal to listen helped doom his own army was elevated into a god. So here's what I keep coming back to, and I'd genuinely like to know where you land on it. If Lee had listened to Longstreet, if he'd accepted from the start that Grant could not be beaten the old way and had fought a different kind of war, a defensive war meant to make the North tired of the cost rather than seeking the grand victory that never came, would the outcome have changed? Could the Confederacy have actually negotiated its way out instead of being ground into nothing? Or was Longstreet right about something even bigger? That by 1864, with Grant in command, the war was already lost, and the only real choice left was how many more men would die before everyone admitted it. Longstreet saw the end coming. He said it out loud, and history punished him for being the one who was right, while turning the man who wouldn't listen into a legend. Maybe that tells you everything about how history actually gets written. It isn't always the truth that survives. Sometimes it's the myth that people needed more. What do you think Lee saw when he looked at Grant across those years? Pride? Fear? Or something he recognized in himself and couldn't admit? I have my answer. I don't think you'll agree with it.